Hey up and welcome to the Temple of Bleh. Shit's been quiet recently. I've been on a bit of a break. Obviously, I was shooting in New York. Came back and decided, you know what's good? A fucking bit of sleep. So I had a bit of sleep. Now I'm kind of doing some reconciliation work for the documentary. Mostly admin and things like that. Making sure some people haven't forgotten I exist, all that shit. Anyway. This is a conversation with Steve Riccardo, who you might remember from some of the earlier episodes of the podcast relating to the Roadrunner shit. So I was in New York shooting, as I mentioned, and obviously Steve was there. We wanted to record this there, like on a dictaphone, with like the sounds of Brooklyn in the background, because that would have been totally fucking badass. But fate intervened, and I ended up navigating the New York subway at 7 in the fucking morning with the rest of the commuters to deal with some camera issues. But you know, that's how it happens. Here we're dealing with Steve's not Roadrunner career. We're doing everything else. So his long history in music is being explored in this conversation. All right. So what you want to do is you want to look under this podcast wherever you're seeing it and click the link. That'll take you to Blowing Smoke with Twisted Rico. Right. So that's Steve's podcast. We're both airing this episode with different intros on both podcasts. But here's the thing: Steve's podcast, Blowing Smoke with Twisted Rico, is a real podcast. It actually is a proper podcast, not this piece of shit. So do that. Just listen to it on his, because the numbers mean something there. Whereas I don't even know how many people listen to this. This just fucking goes up, and it's fire and forget. So click the link below and listen to this on Blowing Smoke with Twisted Rico. Steve's got a more sort of compelling, dulcet tonality to his voice anyway. So 1, 2, fuck shit up. Because like our entire friendship has been built around like the 8 months you spent a Roadrunner, I've actually done zero fucking prep, because I thought, because it's an inverse interview. Instead of researching certain bits, I'm now just saying, ask anything which isn't Roadrunner. And I kind of figured when I listen to your podcast, I don't get the impression that you're going into your career a lot. Obviously, you have a lot of relationships which you've formed, and you've extrapolated on those friendships and those connections and brought people to the podcast. But I don't think you've done one where you're going, this is me, Steve, and this is my career. So maybe this would be quite an interesting, for your subscribers to go, well, what the fuck's Steve done? Like, well, because it's quite an extensive career that you've got, right?
I think it's a great idea. Everyone I told about this thinks it's a good idea, so I'm down. So whenever you want to start, here I am.
So I know you started out at Greenwald, right?
Yeah, well, Greenworld actually and Enigma were the same company when I started there. It was Greenworld and Enigma fell under the Greenworld umbrella. The guys that started Greenworld, Bill and Wes Hine, started it with Steve Boudreau, who was the guy that ended up running Greenworld. It wasn't until I was there for about a year and a half that they split. And it became the Enigma Entertainment Corporation, and Greenworld Distribution went in their own direction. But when I did go out to California in January, I started there January 4th, 1984, and my job was to sell records over the phone. And I was pretty young at the time. And I just got out of college, and I bought a one-way ticket to LA from Boston. Right. And this guy, Paul Murata, hired me. He used to play in all these Cleveland punk bands like the Styrenes, Electric Eels, Mirrors. He wrote songs for Para Ubu. It was like a 70s art punk scene that he was part of. And he hired me, and this is what he said. He goes, I have a bunch of Californians in here. I need some East Coast blood. He'd come out from New York, from Cleveland to New York to LA. And that's why he said he gave me the job. And they gave me the worst pile of accounts that you could have. But I was really good on the phone, man. I was able to start selling records, and I worked my way up fast in the company. Yeah. So that was my first thing I did, was sell records over the phone.
84.
Yes.
Fuck, man. But it's funny how this is the same guy that would also say, you need to go back to the East Coast and work with Case.
It is
the same guy.
Well, you have a very good memory because he is the same guy that said that. You have an excellent memory. Paul Murata twice told me the guy welcomed me, and then he said, "Go back." That's very good. I like that.
So how do you move from distribution into presumably A&R in an
Well, what happened was Paul. This is funny because Paul moved to the East Coast to open up Green World, New York, and guess who one of the first people that he hired was? Holly Lane. So basically, that's how Holly Lane and I ended up knowing each other, because of Paul Murata. So when Paul left, I'd only been there 10 months. And they moved me to the sales manager job. So I knew I was doing a good job, and I picked up all the huge accounts and everything. And I ended up like doing really well. But then the guys on the label side started thinking, why don't we get this guy over here to come and sell to our distributors? Because it was still an independently distributed label in America at the time, Enigma. Yeah. And they had just gotten Striper. So they saw that I could figured out some ways to sell Striper, Christian bookstores and things like that. And they stole me from the sales department. And that's when the two companies split. I feel like I was right in the middle of the split.
While I'm in the background here, and I'm also looking up things as you're saying them, right? So I'm looking at Enigma and looking at everyone that's on Enigma. So if you see things flashing on the screen, that's what I'm doing.
That's cool.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Well, the job they gave me was, you're in charge of all the distributors selling our records wholesale to Gem, Important, Caroline, Dutch East India, all Rough Trade, all of those companies. So that was my job. And they said, you're also in charge of retail, because we don't have a retail presence. So you're in charge of all the chains. That's how it started. And then I said, well, the real reason I came here is I want to be an A&R guy. I want to sign bands. They said, okay, if you want to sign bands, bring the bands in and we'll consider them. And we had meetings every week. And they would consider the bands I brought in. So I ended up having a lot on my plate when I went over there, but I was really young, aggressive, and extremely enthusiastic. And I bought a one-way ticket to LA just to be in this position. So that's how that went.
So who did you bring into Enigma then? Which bands did you bring in?
Well, the biggest band that I brought in, it took me a long time to get them signed, was Poison, because I fought long and hard to get Poison signed, because no one else wanted to sign Poison. And that just doesn't go for us. That goes for every other label. But when I went and saw them, I felt like this band could become big. I just had a feeling, because the first show I went to was at the Troubadour. These two girls that worked on the Green World side, Debbie and Jennifer, Debbie Rogers, who ended up working with Iron Maiden for like 15 years or something. Wow. They were telling me I should check this band out. So I went to the Troubadour, and first thing I noticed is the line. Out of the 200 people, there were like 190 girls. And I'm like, okay, this is like the Beatles, man. This is good. So we get in there, I'm watching, and then it was like a lot of excitement. I'm not into the glam metal thing at all at this point in my life. I'm like a punk kid kind of from Boston, into like alternative and punk and that stuff, like I was more into like, Black Flag and the Replacements and bands like that I was in, the Neighborhoods and bands like that I was into, like glam, I didn't care about Motley Crue and Rat, but they were there and I was there. So it took a long time, but finally I got everyone to agree, mostly the Hine brothers, and we got the band signed. Because of their success, and then this guy, Scott Vanderbilt, that I worked with, wanted to sign the Smithereens. And I went to Boston, and they were playing there, and the Hines said, go check them out. So when I came back and we got in a meeting, they looked me straight in the eye and they said, do you think that band can sell 10,000 records? Just tell us right now. Because if you say no, we're not signing them. So I looked over, and Scott had that like sad kind of look on his face, like, please say yes. And I'm like, yes. they ended up having a fucking gold record, of course. So then we had Striper, Poison, and Smithereens, and that's when Capitol came along. And so when Capitol came along, those guys preferred me to stick with the independent stuff. And that's when I started Restless Records under Enigma. And I signed the Outlets, Neighborhoods, Straw Dogs, Ronnie Montrose, but Ronnie Montrose we put through Enigma because Ronnie was a lot bigger, obviously, than those bands. And then there were other bands that I signed that were smaller, like Personal Effects, DC LaCroix. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but it was mostly, I didn't sign a lot of bands there, but probably like 8 bands. I signed more in years after that, but at Enigma, that was the whole deal as far as A&R go. We always had a say in everything, like we would bring labels in and, they would ask for my opinion, like Fever Records had the Effigies, the Dead Milkmen. What do you think about this? And I'm like, Dead Milkmen, they're kind of weird, but yeah. And they had Bitchin' Camaro, which became a #1 college radio. So I kind of had a lot to do with everything. That's how Enigma was. When I got there were 8 of us. When I left, there were like 50, we grew really quickly.
Yeah. You didn't have anything to do with G.G. Allen, did you?
No. But I know I knew G.G. Allen. But no, I did not have anything to do with G.G. Allen.
The first time we spoke about, I asked about Thor, didn't I?
Yeah, Thor was on Enigma. That was before I got there, though. I didn't really have much to do with. There were other bands that ended up getting signed that I got conversations started. That happens at every label, though. You leave and then someone else signs the band you wanted to sign.
Yeah, exactly.
That happened with Gang Green at Roadrunner.
Yeah, it's a dark art, really, isn't it? Yeah, interesting. So so from this sort of point, you obviously get the call to go to Roadrunner. You leave Roadrunner because we're not going to dwell on it because we've done it for 2 years. It
was still like the best, most miserable 8 months of my life. How's that for a quote?
Well, okay, I think we got that, didn't we?
Yeah, I'll tell you what happened. So when I knew that I was getting fired, I started talking to two companies, Important, which had Combat and Relativity, and Giant and an unknown label, which was going to go through Dutch East India. Barry Coburn and Howie Gabriel and Alan Becker, I knew those guys really well. So I had several meetings with them, and they kept me just dragging along. But Barry Tannenbaum over at Dutch East India was like, you can come in here, you can start your own label, you'll have your own office, everything. And I got sick of waiting for Important. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to take this other job. And then Barry did eventually call me, goes, well, I wanted you for an A&R job, but I wish I could do his accent, but I can't. I wanted you to do A&R, but we decided that, you were better at other things, but you're gone now anyway. So, so I never ended up working there. So I worked it. So when I went to Giant, it was great because Barry told me I could sign wherever I wanted, and he actually gave me the money to sign the bands that I wanted. Mm-hmm. So I built a really good roster there with Government Issue was kind of already in the building because they were getting distributed, but he still said, do you want them on the label? I said, yes. So after that, I got INC, which was Indestructible Noise Command. They were a metal band, which Holly Lane actually turned me on to when I was at Roadrunner. But I guess she tried to get Case Wessels to do something. He wouldn't. But I did. I signed him. And then Dag Nasty, Verbal Assault, Government Issue, as I mentioned, Uniform Choice, Marginal Man. These were all like punk bands. So I had one metal band and all punk band. Also Steel Vengeance from Michigan. They were a metal band. And we had a weird deal with Pentagram where they weren't really on the label, but we marketed the Day of Reckoning album for Pentagram. So I got to know Bobby Liebling early on before Pentagram became really a big band, because I talked to him on the phone a lot.
Was Government Issue Hawker as well at some point?
I don't think so. No, I don't know if any of the. We also put a 7 Seconds record out, but it was a live album. and we did Salvation soundtrack. That was a deal we had with D Crepuscule. They were a Belgium label.
Right.
Barry brought that one to me, and it was Anna Domino, The Hood, and this soundtrack that had New Order and Cabaret Voltaire on it. And so that record sold like 35,000 copies. That was a big one. But the Dag Nasty and the Government Issue, I mean, Dag Nasty and Uniform Choice both sold over 30,000. And that's a lot for independent in 1988, you know, when that was around that time. We did really well. But what ended up happening to me, you know, I'm going to answer your question before you ask it. I got sick of living. I was living in New York City for the first year, and then I moved out to Long Island, and I couldn't stand it out there. And Brian Slagle, I don't know why, out of the blue, he just wrote me and said, "Hey, what's up, man? How you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to be in LA in a couple of weeks. You want to get together?" And I was flying out to LA, and I met with him, and I went over to the label, and he gave me a tour, and I was really, really impressed with Metal Blade. I was like, wow, this place is really cool, you know. And plus all the guys that worked there, I knew all about them, like Mike Faley.
Yeah.
He managed Billy Sheehan, and William Howell. He was a well-known LA, you know, scenester dude. And, you know, so we walked around the office, and then he took me into this empty office and closed the door behind it. He goes, "You come and work here. This is your office." And I'm like, wow, this is cool. It was in Sherman Oaks in the Valley. And I'm like, wow, there's green out my window, you know? And I was like, wow, cool. And so I went back home, and I was like, what am I going to do? I'm running my own label, and now Metal Blade wants to hire me. And then 3 weeks went by, and then I called Brian up, and I said, you know what? Make me an offer. I think I'm interested. And then he left me an offer on my answering machine. This is before cell phones. This is like 90, something like that. And I don't get my dates are all screwed up, so don't ask me the dates. And so basically I went into Dutch East India, and I was giving a sales presentation to the sales staff. And in the middle of it, I said, I don't know what made me say it. I said, I don't know what you're going to do, because I'm not being here. I'm moving to LA. And everyone looked at me like, what? And then Barry Tannenbaum called me, goes, "You're really moving to LA?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." And I went up and talked to him, and he just shook my hand and said, "Wish me the best." And Debbie Southwood Smith had come in and was working with me. It was Billy Polisi. I got Billy Polisi and Debbie Southwood Smith both came to help me at Giant. There were three of us. And Billy ended up going to Century Media, starting up their New York office. And Debbie ended up going to a major label. I can't remember which one now. She ended up at A&M because we worked together years later. But she signed oh my God, why can't I think of the name of the band? She signed a really huge band, stoner rock band. I'm like spacing out on them.
A&M.
No, this was at, I can't remember the label she went to. I think it was Intercord. It doesn't matter. So they took over and they changed the name of the label to Rockville Records.
Oh,
and
okay.
And that's what happened with Giant. It became Rockville. And then Barry really capitalized and sold the name Giant to this guy at Warner's for 75 grand. Of course, I didn't get a nickel of that, but you know, that's how the record industry, I never got a nickel from Poison either. So that's how the record industry works, man. You know, like I think I told you.
Did you not, how did you not get anything from, do you not get any points or anything like that?
The only one that ever gave me points ever was Case Wessels. I was the only guy that ever gave me a point on any record.
Wow.
Queens of the Stone Age. Queens of the Stone Age was the band that Debbie Southwood Smith signed. She had ended up having a decent career because of that signing, obviously. In America, they were a huge band.
I guess Enigma at the time when Poison came in, it's still a very young independent, right? So it's, it probably wouldn't have even occurred to you. Yeah, man.
We were making like $30,000 a year. Okay, we weren't making any money back then. It was like, I know that sounds like a lot back then, but it wasn't enough.
There's like, before we move into the Metal Blade sort of era and the 90s and beyond, one of the things that I don't know a lot about is your punk sort of roots and your punk sort of foundation, right? And I asked this to Howie Abrams the first time because I've heard Dag Nasty and Government Issue a number of times, like throughout just listening to any American music podcast. So can you tell me a bit about Dag Nasty?
Well, Dag Nasty, the reason why Dag Nasty had such a big buzz going is because Brian Baker from Minor Threat started Dag Nasty. And when he first started the band, there was a guy named Sean Brown, but he didn't last very long. And they got Dave Smalley, who came from a band called DYS, which was a big Boston hardcore band. So with the two of them together, people were like already calling it an all-star band. And then they signed with Discord for 2 records. And I signed them from Discord. And they had a different singer. And then Doug Carrion from The Descendants was on bass now. And so the 2 records I put out were a different lineup. But Brian Baker, who's now in Bad Religion, that's why Dag Nasty's so famous. He was Minor Threat and Bad Religion, Dag Nasty in the middle.
Because I know fuck all about the sort of like micro scenes, like the New York hardcore scene, presumably the Boston hardcore scene. I should have an Old York hardcore scene because that's where Old York is. But it's kind of the one thing I do know about those scenes are they're very difficult to penetrate and understand unless you're part of it. Like, I'm not massively into hardcore, right? But I know that if I went to a hardcore gig, I'd probably be in a much better position to comment on everything because I know it's more of a vibe kind of thing, right? It's not, you can't listen to a hardcore record and then go, all right, I'm into hardcore. You have to penetrate the scene, right? You have to penetrate the social circles. You need to attend the events. Otherwise, you're not going to understand it. Have I got it right?
Yeah, you do. And interestingly enough, hardcore really started in DC and in LA. Minor Threat was from DC. Black Flag was from LA. They were the bands that really got going. Then the Dead Kennedys from San Francisco. Then SSD Control from Boston, DYS, Gangrene, The Freeze, all those bands came out. So, and then, LA had their bands too, Circle Jerks, DC had other punk bands, So there was like merging scenes that all have Bad Brains, DC,
Yeah.
New York, ironically enough, they weren't part of the original hardcore scene. They came along later. Cro-Mags and those bands, Agnostic Front, came out. The SSD and Minor Threat in 1980 were big. Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags were 84, 85, 86. So they were the second wave, really, of hardcore.
This is the oral history of hardcore with Steve Riccardo, isn't it? This is what I've
always to give you an idea how I got into it, I was in college radio before I left. And on college radio, you could play anything. And we played a lot of hardcore and punk, along with the Echo and the Bunnymen and U2 and REM. But we also played the hardcore Crass, from England, UK Subs, all the English bands too. I mean, you could play anything on college radio, and I always liked the more aggressive stuff. I wasn't really a metalhead. I've never really been a full-on metalhead, although Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest are some of my favorite bands of all time. Deep Purple, even, they're metal. And then as far as thrash goes, I like a lot of those bands too, but I mostly have been more of a hardcore punk indie rock guy than a metal guy, but I do love metal. It's that I'm not like a metal head,
I think this is the difference. And this is what I like to analyze, because academically, I observe hardcore and I understand hardcore. I understand the names, which is why I'm bringing it all up, but I don't live it and therefore I don't know it. Right. Whereas on the metal side, I'm there front row headbanging. I understand the aesthetics of like metal thrashing mad. I understand I was actually saying to Monty recently about there was like a new wave of thrash that sort of came about maybe about 15 years ago. And I was sort of commenting that Municipal Waste with this band that sort of captured what my generation thought thrash was back then. We have this sort of like, how do I describe it, man? It's like the Airheads effect, right? We have this sort of nostalgia for this time that we weren't around for. And I think Municipal Waste really captured that aesthetic really well, even though it probably wasn't like that at all. But we have the idea in our head. And the point I was trying to get at was, because I'm a metal guy, I feel very locked into what that nostalgia was and what metal actually is in terms of going to the gigs and into the scenes and things like that. With hardcore, I'm always going to be an outsider until I fucking like get my face smashed in a Madball show or something like that. I feel like there's different trials into those.
See, here's the thing, you got the new wave of British heavy metal, and they influenced so many bands in America, but the influences became very heavier. I mean, when Slayer and Metallica and those bands came out, they were almost like hardcore bands. It was really close. There was a lot of crossover in those early days, between the hardcore and metal bands. When I'm talking about 83, 84 now, it was like they crossed over a lot. So a lot of hardcore kids became thrash metal fans.
The big one's Motorhead, though, isn't it? That's the ultimate
crossover. Motorhead, Venom, well, they're more like a black metal, but, those bands could cross over. They definitely could cross over.
But it feels like those scenes anyway, they kind of like existed, they compartmentalized themselves after the fact.
Yeah.
They kind of broke away. So we can say Motorhead's like a crossover band in retrospect, but at the time there was nothing like it.
Exactly. Yeah. They're a totally original band. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm just saying that a lot of the kids could go to both types of shows and you could get away with it. There was, of course, the hardcore metal kids and the hardcore skinhead punks that wouldn't go to metal shows, but I saw what was happening with Show No Mercy and Kill 'Em All. I mean, it was pretty obvious to me, okay, this is close enough where the hardcore kids are going to like this, and they did. So
I mean, Rain in Blood, like, I don't trust anyone who doesn't like Rain in Blood. There's a place in everyone's head for that aesthetic, right? Everyone has like a thing where it's like they can activate that riff or whatever, and it's quite cathartic. And I think that's the magic of that record. But I digress. So I imagine, just to sort of like continue interrogating hardcore from an outsider perspective, the geography of these scenes doesn't matter, right? New York, Boston, DC, it doesn't really matter. It's just some way that it's in the same way we talk about Florida death metal and some like West Coast death metal. It doesn't really matter. It's just the way that we kind of position these bands, because it gives us more of a picture, right? That's all.
It's like also a respect thing, I think. Like the Boston hardcore bands are very proud of themselves. Like the album This Is Boston Not LA came out, when that came out, a lot of people were like, what, you're starting a fight with the LA bands? And that's kind of what ended up happening. And there was a lot of brawling between Boston and New York hardcore bands. There's stories about brawls breaking out when the bands would go to each other's town. I mean, I saw a lot of that, and it existed, and there was intimidation going on, and one city thought they were tougher than the other. Boston's always had like a real attitude about everything. People up here, they don't call people here mass holes for nothing. Okay. I mean, people think the New Yorkers are the assholes, but come up here and you'll find out, I mean, it's like, and then LA's a more, laid back. So it was kind of a surprise that, they became so important in the hardcore scene. But Henry Rollins is from DC, so a lot of these guys moved out to California, and then the band, got in bands, but I really do like the LA hardcore bands. I'd say Boston, LA, and New York DC are my favorite. San Francisco had the Dead Kennedys and Flipper and bands like that. And then there were other bands in different scenes. But yeah, it doesn't matter. You're right, because Florida, I haven't heard anybody talk about that Florida death metal scene in a while, but Deicide and those bands were like, when they came out, they were the scariest fuckers around, man. You kidding me? Glenn Benton, get in a fight every night wherever he was, man. He never backed down from anybody, Sick.
I'm contractually obliged to research them now. To round off this oral history of hardcore, so now you know that I'm an outsider on this sort of thing. I have no root in, right? So could you recommend me like 3 hardcore records that you'd recommend to like a fucking like to a 12-year-old?
You've really taken me in directions I didn't think I was going into.
Oh, dude, I'm like I said, no prep, but I feel like I know where your head's at, like a lot of the time. So I'm like, but I also know what I don't know. So I'm like, I know what I could use Steev for.
Okay, I'm gonna pull these out of
pull them
nowhere
out.
here,
Don't think too much about it.
The kids will have their say. SSD definitely. The Minor Threat, Out of Step, and then I would say Damage, Black Flag. But I do like a lot of other records. So I'm a big Flipper fan, and they pissed off a lot of people in hardcore, but I like Generic Flipper. I'd put that record up there. And then I like bands like the Big Boys from Texas, Fun, and the Freeze, Land of the Lost. That's way more than 3. I'm sorry.
No, it's cool.
Wild in the Streets, Circle Jerks, Wild in the Streets. That's a great one.
It matters right now because at the minute I'm in the middle of a break, so I'm like, I'm gonna pull my head out my ass and stop listening to Roadrunner records for like fucking 5 minutes, and I'm gonna put like the top 3. The kids will have their say, Out of Step, and Damage. I'm gonna put them on just like on rotation and just obsess over it. Because I think that's how I'm finding the way I connect with music more is if I put it on, if I force myself to like have it in the car. Like this is why CDs were so good, because unless you were bothered to take it out, you just hear it again and again, and it started building itself into your muscle memory. If I just get the guitar out and start just jamming along, then it'll connect more. And I'm hoping to connect something totally different.
Jerry's Kids, Is This My World? Okay, just like let me start all over again, because if I don't have Jerry's Kids, Is This Not My World in the top 3, I'd be out of my mind. So I'm sorry, Jerry's Kids.
What am I kicking out? Am I kicking out Black Flag, Minor Threat, or SSD for Jerry's Kids in favor of Jerry's Kids? You got to choose.
Oh my God, I would take Jerry's. I can't kick out SSD, or I can't kick out Minor Threat, so it's going to have to be Black Flag.
You know what? I actually already did that because I'm familiar with Damage. So I was like, there we go. Yeah. I already know that record quite well.
Jerry's Kids, though, they were the best live band ever. Yeah, I mean, as far as hardcore goes, and that lineup had Chris Doherty from Gangrene. So it was like, and you know, this is Boston Not LA compilation, has Jerry's Kids and Gangrene on it, doing multiple songs. So that could be in my top 3 too. Man, I'm a real asshole when it comes to picking top 3s. I love lists, but that's putting me on the spot right there.
Has hardcore aged well, right? And I'm asking this because I can't sit in a field and listen to the 12-minute versions of Wheels of Steel. I can't listen to it. Saxon is still pretty good, right? They're still doing what they're doing. But I think like it had its time and it's carried forward. Whereas Iron Maiden are fucking delivering the goods. Actually, that's quite a contentious thought, because post-2000s Maiden is very much more a proggy thing. But there's like, for example, Slayer before the Pact In were just like relentlessly delivering the same kind of thing, right? In a really good way. And I think metal can age well under the right circumstances. So are you seeing like 60-year-old hardcore bands delivering the goods, or are they all?
Well, if they're the older bands, if they go on tour, I have tickets to go see the Circle Jerks when they come to town. But, you know, I think as far as the hardcore scene goes, the second wave was, for me, the end of it. You know, after Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags and those bands, I don't really... Anything that happened like after that was okay, but it's not going to be 80 to 84 ever again.
Oh, sure. But I mean, do those bands still deliver though? When you see Agnostic Front these days, are they still like, this is still a spectacle and an experience? Or is it kind of like, they've lost it?
Okay, I'm just going to give you one example. In 2011, they had a Boston hardcore reunion show, and Slapshot, who I didn't mention, they're very good. Slapshot, DYS, Gangrene, and Jerry's Kids all played, and they all delivered the goods.
Right, okay, good.
It was great. But, you know, if Chris Doherty didn't have a stroke and he couldn't play anymore, Gangrene would probably still be out there playing right now. The only band that hasn't come back and done a reunion is SSD Control, and it's upsetting to a lot of people. They haven't. Minor Threat will never do a reunion either, probably, you know. Bad Brains, you know, I don't think they're gonna. I think they're done too, you know. Black Flag. There were 2 versions of Black Flag on tour at the same time a couple of years ago. You know, Keith Morris was fronting one, and then Greg Ginn had the other one with 3 unknown guys, the guitar player.
Right.
So I would still go see any of those bands.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
Agnostic Front too. I don't think they would. They're consistently good band. Cro-Mags have split into two bands too. So a lot of these bands have kind of split.
I fucking hate when that happens.
Queensryche did it too, and they're not hardcore.
It's when they use the same name which bothers me.
Yeah.
When they say it's some like John Smith's fucking whatever it is, it bothers me. I think like I have like an issue with names anyway. I don't when someone fucks off and does like a solo thing, I think they shouldn't name it after themselves because it puts me off. The only exception is Slash. Slash has delivered good solo stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to be one of those typical old guys that says everything was good way back then and nothing's good now, because I do find good records coming out here and there. You know, it's just that I feel like as far as classic rock goes, the 70s were unbelievable, and it's going to be hard to top that. And then the late 70s punk scene, and then the early 80s hardcore, and then the 80s metal. To me, that was all the best stuff. 90s had a lot of big selling records, you know, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains. I just named 4 Seattle bands in a row, by the way. You know, they were all good bands, and there were other bands from around the world that came out. But to me, the 70s and 80s were like uncomparable.
I think a lot of it is to do with focal points and saturation, right? Because in the 70s, if you could get 5 lads who played instruments to actually get in a van and go up the M1 and play in your shithole town, that's quite an achievement in itself, worthy of your £5 in a way, right? But these days, because any can do it, it's not so much that it's less valuable, but it's much more difficult to approach, and it's much more difficult to gather momentum. So
it's like saying who's going to be the next Queen, you know? I mean, there's never going to be another band that good, you know?
The only way you can get anything close to that is if the particular band can cultivate their own vibe and cultivate their own sort of enthusiasm. Okay, that's what Queen did. They had a very specific kind of vibe to them, right? And it's going to be very difficult for bands to do that under the current circumstances. That's not saying that today's shit. It's just saying that the fans have to work harder to pledge their support, and it's a different economic climate to do so, right? But yeah, no, it's I don't know what to say about that in terms of like a lot of it's where I'm coming from with the Roadrunner thing, right? Because I bet there's 10 bands. So my favorite band's Iron Maiden, AC/DC, quite cliched. There's some other great bands which I'll send you after this actually, because I think there's some you might like. But there's probably like 10 or 20 bands I would like more than Iron Maiden and AC/DC, but I'll never hear from them because they slipped through the net because there wasn't the infrastructure there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. With me, I've got to say something about AC/DC. I didn't like them after Bon Scott died. I still don't. I was a big Bon Scott fan, but Brian Johnson, nothing against them. I just don't think they ever came close to what they were, even though they sold more records.
I think sorry, go on.
I was going to say, you know, they just had a big, you know, festival here in Boston, and the headliners were Metallica and Weezer. You know, they were bands that Foo Fighters was supposed to be, but they had to cancel. These are bands that have been around for like 20, 30 years. They can't get right now. People always say to me, well, who do you think's the best band in the world right now? And I'm like, Arcade Fire. I mean, I don't know, you know, it's like you can't really compare to those bands, you know.
I wonder what it's like, because I think like those headlining slots are kind of like the Kingmakers in a way. And I bet whoever's organizing them, especially these days, is like, right, what are we going to do? Are we going to punt on Turnstile? Are we going to punt on fucking Atreyu? Are we going to punt on these bands? Or should we just go, let's do the Metallica, Iron Maiden, Foo Fighters cycle? Because like, what's going to sell? And there needs to be some certainty. But someone out there is going to go like, fuck it, Saturday Night Donington. It's going to be this little baby band that has 2 records out.
The last Turnstile record, by the way, is excellent. So that's a good band that you brought. Naked Reagan, too. They put out a new record. They've been around for 30 years. They're a Chicago punk band, you know. They're really good. So it's not – some of these bands are still putting out good records, you know. I mean, Turnstile, I don't think 10 years old maybe.
No, I think less than that. I think like 20.
Yeah. So, but you know, 9 Inch Nails was the other headliner at Boston Calling that I couldn't remember. So think about that, you know, 9 Inch Nails, Metallica, Weezer, Foo Fighters. Those are the bands that get to headline the big festivals.
Yeah. Hey, did you speak to Dave Rath the other night when we were in?
Briefly.
Turnstile, you signed Turnstile.
He did?
Yeah, it was a Roadrunner band.
Wow. Good for him. They were?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they are. You're right. They are. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a good record, man. Yeah, I'm sorry. I knew that. I don't know what I spaced out there for a sec. It happens, man. You know, done a lot of partying over the years. That's why I don't drink anymore, you know? You want to talk about Metal Blade Records before I forget that I worked there?
I was going to go. Should we go? Let's jump back into the chronology. Now I've had my oral history of hardcore.
You really took me on a real sidebar there that I wasn't expecting, but it was good.
Dude, I'm like, yeah, dude, I'm here representing like the outside of people who don't understand like this clique in this scene, right?
And I'm not like, you know, you should have that conversation about hardcore with Mike Gitter. He knows more about the hardcore history than anyone does. Yeah, he's like the king of hardcore. Yeah, he is. He really is. I'm not kidding. You want to know about what happened when I got to Metal Blade?
Yeah. So let's jump back into the life and times. Yeah. So you presumably get another one-way ticket back to LA, right?
See, the advantage I had with Metal Blade is that when I worked at Enigma, we distributed the Metal Blade stuff. Right. So I was selling Show No Mercy and Haunting the Chapel and Animosity by Corrosion of Conformity and all those records, you know, already. So I knew about them. And Brian Slagle, this is no exaggeration. He's probably the nicest guy in the music business I've ever known in my life. Okay. He's just always been that way. He's just a good guy. Yeah. And I love when someone talk shit to me about Brian, I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. He's the one that put Metallica and Slayer and all those bands out before anyone else. So he started the whole thing with the resurgence of metal in America. Roadrunner and labels like that followed in his footsteps. So for me to get there and work for him was really an honor for me. And, you know, I got to work with so many good bands there. I only signed one band because I was the director of marketing there. You know, my job was to sell records, you know, but I did sign Eviction from Pittsburgh and they never really took off, but Brian let me sign them. And I was the product manager for other bands like Intruder and Viking. But mostly my job was making sure that Lizzie Borden, Fates Warning, Armored Saint, DRI, you know, to make sure those bands got bigger. And I think we accomplished a lot, you know, in that time period that I was working there. We ended up getting a deal with Warner Brothers for distribution. We also had the Goo Goo Dolls. That didn't hurt at all to have them because even though they weren't a metal band, Warner Brothers really liked them a lot. So they were an intricate part of the deal. My day-to-day in that office was always a trip. The people that worked there were all cool. I mean, a lot of them went on to have really, really good careers. Cheryl Valentine was a radio person there. She worked for labels for years. Brian Lima, he went to Epic. They were in our New York office, you know, and a lot of us ended up at major labels, you know, that worked there. It was a really good place to work. And Brian, like I said, and Mike Faley too, was the president of the label. And he ran the day-to-day operations. But anytime I ever wanted to go on a trip or go anywhere, Brian said, go do what you have to do. Like I would visit branch offices because we had SEMA for a little while first before Warner Brothers Capital Distribution. Some of our records went through there. And then we got Warner was the big deal. But that didn't last either. Metal Blade has always had to like kind of carve their own way. And that's why when everyone was falling down and falling apart, Metal Blade never left.
Tell me about the Warner tell me about the Warner World and then pre-Warner World to Warner World. What didn't they get? I assume because if you're saying that Metal Blade carved their own way and the Warner deal fell through after a while, what was the difference? Did they not know how to handle the Metal Blade?
Exactly. Like Goo Goo Dolls did really good, but I can't think of any other metal bands that really flourished in the Warner Brother deal. And I think that's why the deal didn't work out. But, you know, I had left by the time they were really kicking in on that deal. So here's the thing. When you're working at a label, sometimes you not have time to pay attention to what's going on everywhere else. That's why I didn't know some of the bands that ended up on Roadrunner. I wasn't paying attention. I really wasn't. I was worried about what I was doing.
Sure.
I didn't know what they were doing. And the same thing with, other labels after I left. I don't know what happened, and all I know is that Metal Blade made it through some really difficult times, because around 2008 and on, it became really difficult to keep a record label going. You had to have really good bands that sold to the mainstream, otherwise you would not survive. But they kept their niche with the lower metal bands. And Brian's had so many, Cannibal Corpse had gotten signed when I was there, and there's so many, I can't remember them all. It was like, really, the ones I named were the bands that were really part of the Metal Blade family. Like all the guys in Armored Saint, they're like best friends with Brian Slagle. They've always have been. Even when Bush went to Anthrax, I remember hanging out with Bush when he was in Anthrax. And one time Brian came in, the three of us went to see a hockey game in Boston once. We all went to Boston to walk, and none of us were in the same place. That's what I liked about Brian. He always maintained, like Betsy Bitch, the band Bitch.
Yep.
She's like the queen of Metal Blade. She's been friends with Brian since day one, since Brian was in his garage. We had other cool bands, like we had Candlemass. When they came to town, I got to hang out with them. Phil Mogg, here's one of my favorite stories about when I worked at Metal Blade. Brian asked me if I could take care of Phil Mogg when he came to town, because we put a UFO record out. So I went and picked him up at his hotel. It was like 9:30 in the morning. And I said, we have a lot of stuff planned for you, interviews and everything. He goes, can I get some beer first? I'm like, all right. So I took him to a liquor store, and he got a tall boy. And then I took him to the office, and Brian didn't give a shit. Phil comes walking in with a tall boy. And two good things happened when he was there. One was, there was an intern at Metal Blade, and she had all the UFO records. I think they're like 22 at that time. Right. And she came in with all of them and asked me if I could get him to sign them. And I was like, 22 records, something like that. And I'm like, I don't know. So I called her in the office. He was sitting in the office. He was in between breaks, and he had the stack, and she had the stack, and he just smiled. He signed every single record for her and told us a story about every record.
Wow.
And then he wanted to go to the Rainbow to meet some friends. And it's because of him that I got to meet Lemmy and John Entwistle, that are sitting at the bar at the Rainbow. Of course, I was the third, standing there. I didn't know what to say. And then he's like, oh, those aren't my friends we were going to meet. Got to hang out with Lita Ford and Chris Holmes from Wasp. It was like, that's what it was like being with Phil. That was one of the greatest 2-3 days of my life working at Metal Blade. Was like, in music industry career, actually, was incredible. And everyone used to love Metal Blade too. And we threw a party, dude. It was the best party. Yeah. Everyone would come to the Metal Blade parties, and we'd go to conventions. We'd all be on panels, at the New Music Seminar, at Foundations, CMJ convention. I was always on some retail panel because I worked there,
Speaking of which, then, and then I've asked Alan Becker this, and so I've had his side of it, and I've asked a couple of people this. So, how important is distribution in this sort of like in the retail arm of metal, especially fringe, not metal, as in like any kind of fringe music, hardcore or metal or just rock of this time? How fucking critical is distribution? Because my perception is these are the guys that know the shops and the ones that can say, you want to stock the neighborhoods. Why do I want to stock the neighborhoods? Because I've never fucking heard of them. Because A, B, C, and D, right? And it's that relationship that propagates those sales, which generates more music. Have I got the right end of it?
Yeah, you're asking the right person, because I worked for Green World Distribution under the Enigma umbrella. And then my job was to sell records to all of those companies. Like, Alan Becker was the buyer at Import, and he was the one I was selling records to when I was at Enigma, Metal Blade, Roadrunner, you name it. All of those companies, Important was number one, them and Gem Distribution, which were based in New York also. Caroline, Rough Trade, and some of the other ones were like a level lower. But Important and Gem were the big ones on the East Coast. Green World was the big one on the West Coast until they went out of business, and then Important and Gem picked up the slack. New bands were extremely difficult. You know, when you had new bands, it was very difficult to get. They would not take a lot. But if a band that was established had a record come out, like, I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to bet that the Striper Soldiers on the Command record that shipped 90,000 units independently was probably the biggest independently distributed record at that time. It was enormous when that came out. And then, you know, all those other bands like Metallica and Slayer, when they were still on independent labels, their sales went through the roof. The Rat EP was really, really huge. I remember that one. Motley Crue on Leather Records, you know, before they got signed. You know, if you didn't have those guys working your records to their key accounts, at that time, America was loaded with record stores. The Music Land chain, Trans World, you know, Record Bar, Strawberries, Waxy Maxy, wherever, with the Warehouse, Licorice Pizza, they even named the movie after them. You know, all of these record stores, you wanted to get as many big quantities in all of those. So it was extremely important. And you had to go, you know, you had to do a lot of ass kissing with those guys. And I had to. I would go and meet with all of them. You know, I would go to Important and Gem and, you know, and Caroline. I knew Steve Daly at Caroline. He was an English dude. He was a good dude. You know, Rough Trade was a little smaller. And, you know, Big State, they were smaller. Twin Cities and Minneapolis, a little smaller. But they were all important. We would, when a record came, we would start probably about a month before the record came out. I'd start telling them, give them the catalog number, and then they'd call their connections. Whoever handled Music Land would call Music Land. Whoever handled Strawberries would call Strawberries. So I don't know if I answered your question. But
no, you did totally. I think the key thing there is, like, America was loaded with record stores at that time, right?
Yeah, there was a lot. Now there's cool vinyl stores popping up around. Vinyl's made a huge comeback here, but the mall stores are not a thing anymore. You used to be able to go in every mall and there'd be like 3 or 4 record stores in every mall.
I don't envy like the retail line these days, because while vinyl is making good money, right? I mean, my understanding is like the money in music is kind of similar to what it used to be from a retail perspective, because we've got different price points where you'd normally spend $5 on a CD. Now you got $5, $20 on the vinyl, $50 on vinyl gig ticket membership of the fan club. There's different price points, and you can kind of like level everything off by then. But as you say, you have vinyl shops, which are typically coffee shops with vinyl listening points, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard to push the $30 vinyl in that setting. And then
there are some good used. Yeah, the used vinyl store, the ones that have used to in America are good stores. Those are the kind of stores I go to if they have new and used. I usually end up buying the used ones, to be honest with you. Paying $30 for a new record is ridiculous.
At the same time, though, most people will probably buy from the band straight direct, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's difficult these days. Just going back to Metal Blade before we go back onto the Life and Times. Did you work that new wave British heavy metal record with? That was another high point, because Brian came into my office one day and he goes, call this guy, and he gave me Lars's phone number. So I got to call Lars. Lars did the liner notes, I believe, on that record. And Brian said, talk to Lars, because I didn't really know much about Diamond Head and all the bands who were on there. Saxon, I can't even remember all the bands that were on that record. It was a double album. And I talked to Lars on the phone, and I just took a lot of notes. He kept me on the phone for like an hour. He was cool, though. It was cool. So how does Metal Blade course through? And how long were you there for?
3 years, I think.
3, right.
It's kind of sad why I left Metal Blade, but there was...
You don't have to go into it if you don't want.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing about myself is I try to be brutally honest about everything that's happened in my career. And, you know, sometimes I don't always get along. I didn't get along with people. And they had a lawyer there that his office was in our office, and him and I were constantly butting heads. And I finally got sick of him. And one day I just told Brian, I'm going to leave. And I left. And you know what? I thought I was going to take a break. My plan was to leave and take a break But then I ended up getting this crazy phone call. I'm going to segue for you. I get this crazy phone call from this guy at Hits Magazine, Bud Scarpa. And he's like, you're not going to believe this, but Michael Douglas is starting a record label. And I got a meeting. Will you come to the meeting with me? I'm like, what? You want me to go to a meeting with you? He said, yeah, you're the one that's been working for all these labels. So I went, and here's the funny thing about it. I ended up working there and he didn't. Third Stone Music. And it was it wasn't really a record label because we only ended up putting 2 records out while I was there. It was Saigon Kick and The Neighborhoods, who I'd signed for the 3rd time, okay? Because I signed them twice already. And it went through Atlantic. My job mostly was to be an assistant on music to the music supervisor, Dick Rudolph, and just sign people to publishing deals. I signed a bunch of publishing deals there.
That's an amazing
Nothing
name,
that
Dick
became
Rudolph.
enormously huge. But it was interesting because I had meetings with people that I ended up working with later, like Sheryl Crow came in once, and we had a meeting with her about a publishing deal. She didn't do a deal with us, but I ended up at A&M. She was on A&M.
Right,
so,
okay.
Like, that's how things happen. But Third Stone, to me, I was there 2 years and they folded. They ended up going down. It was like a tax write-off for the great actor, Michael Douglas, I guess. But I got to meet Michael Douglas and I got to be in a movie because I worked there. I was in a movie called Hard Promises. I played bass in the band. That was great. And I got to go to a lot of movie premieres and I met a ton of actors. Like one time I'm in the bathroom taking a leak and Jean-Claude Van Damme's pissing next to me. It was awesome, man, you know. How you doing, Jean-Claude Van Damme? You know, and I met like Kiefer Sutherland and Julia Roberts, Emilio Estevez, Christian Slater. I met John Bon Jovi because he did the music for Hard Promises, and I ended up in this party with all these people on not Hard Promises, Young Guns too. And I ended up in this party with everybody, and I'm talking to all these people. So that was the good part of that job, but it wasn't really a music job. It wasn't until after that that I got back into the game, and I worked for A&M Records, and that's where
So it kind of was a break in a weird way then.
Yeah.
That's fucking so funny. Oh, that's ridiculous.
But you know, it was interesting being around actors a lot. I learned a lot from that experience, you know. And Michael Douglas, I got to, you know, a few times he came out and had drinks with us, and he was a cool dude, you know. He was just, you know, he was kind of like Gordon Gekko in Wall Street in person, you know. It was weird, but you know, it was.
I want to ask what you learned from being around actors, but I'm going to lead in with the question of like, what's the main difference between actors and musicians? Because I know these are all like, because I work with musicians quite a lot, like outside of the Roadrunner thing, right? So, and I know that a lot of them are sort of neurotic, weird fucking people. And I
almost said ego is the big difference, but no, that was not the big difference. The egos were very similar, and I guess in some cases, rock stars had bigger egos than actors.
Yeah.
I think for me, the biggest difference that I would notice from the actors I know is that musicians, it really is 24/7. Actors, it's like they go play their part and that's it. Musicians, though, they're constantly living their lifestyle. They're constantly looking and living the lifestyle. That's the biggest difference, I would say. And I've had friends in both of those areas and still do. You know, but I think when you're a rock star, you grew up, you want to be a rock star, you're a rock star 24/7. Most of them.
Yeah.
Most of them.
No, fair enough. I was
and many die young, you know?
Yeah. Because I'm trying to I'm trying to understand the character of a musician a little bit more. I know it's a bit too fucking artsy fartsy, but it's like everyone has so many different sort of walks of life and so many different foundations of which their personalities and their general output and outgoingness is built upon. And I thought I knew how to deal with musicians, right? I thought I knew how to deal with them. And then when you sit down in front of them and have like a different kind of relationship, because normally I'm doing sound for them, it's a lot different. It's a different kind of intense than when you sat in front of them and trying to extract information from them. So I was just interested to to ask
The
what
one thing I've noticed from a lot of musicians, not the ones I've become really close to, is if you work for a label or you're on the industry side, they don't trust you at all. Yeah. They really don't. They have no trust for you whatsoever. I've had people even say to me, man, I used to think that you were a total A&R weasel, when I first met you, but then I realized you're more than that, They don't like you. I've heard people badmouth it's always the label's fault when the record doesn't break. It's never the band's fault. God forbid they did something wrong, I'm sorry to all the musicians out there that are listening, because I have most of my closest friends are musicians, but most of them will not take the blame for where they went wrong,
One of the difficult things about the documentary is that people think I'm working with Roadrunner. It's like, no, dude, I'm fucking nobody. So there's like an inbuilt distrust for me for some people.
I'm going to ask you a question about that documentary, but as soon as we finish up with this stuff, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
We'll wait till the end.
We'll do that.
So I don't really, there's not much else I can tell you about Third Stone other than I met some really cool people. Mick Taylor, I had an interview with once. He came into my office, not an interview, but he came in and played me his music from the Stones. Earl Slick, who played with David Bowie for years. I mentioned John Bon Jovi. And with Paula Abdul, I met with her once. It was like I got to meet really cool people at Third Stone.
Before or after the plane crash?
Who's plane crash?
Paula Abdul. There's a massive conspiracy theory about Paula Abdul.
I don't know anything about the plane crash.
Oh, dude, I'll send you this video. It's so much fun. It's basically a conspiracy theory about this plane crash she was in. So about 95, she was in a. I'll tell you, it's actually
this would be before that. This would be before that. This would be 91 ish. Oh, like I said, my years are a little off here on some of this stuff. But Third Stone, my time just ran out there. I got bored really quickly. I didn't work with a lot of labels for a long, long time. A&M was the one I was with the longest. Sure. But I would get bored and I would move on, or someone would come along and steal me from a label, like what happened with Roadrunner and Enigma and Metal Blade and Giant. It was just but. After I left, I didn't have a very long break after I left. I never had any breaks, dude, until I left A&M. And then when I started my own management company, I didn't have a break either, but from labels I did. But Brian Huttenhauer, when I was at Metal Blade, something I didn't mention to you that was very interesting is all these major labels would come to us and ask us to help them develop their artists. Like really? I remember I worked on Mother Love Bone.
Wow.
I worked on Jane's Addiction. Yeah. I worked on Circus of Power, Little Caesar, Michael Monroe, because Geffen released the Hanoi catalog, and they hired us to do that. And then Polygram had Michael Monroe's solo record, and they hired us to do that. Well, when A&M came to us and we worked on Soundgarden before Louder Than Love came out, I met Brian Huttenhauer, who signed Soundgarden. So after I was with Third Stone, one night I was at the Coconut Teaser, where all A&R guys would go every Thursday night, and they would check out new talent. They had ASCAP's Best Kept Secrets, it was called. And I saw Brian there, and Brian's like, hey, what's up, man? What are you doing? And I told him what I was doing with Third Stone, but I knew I wasn't going to be there. He goes, well, keep in touch. So I saw him again, and he's like, would you ever be, and this was after I just left Third Stone, he goes, would you be interested in being an A&R consultant? And I'm like, I'm not sure what that is, but okay. So I went down, I met with him at A&M, and then I had to meet with David Anderley, who was like a legend. He used to be A&R guy for the Beach Boys and the Doors. And they hired me as an A&R consultant. Wow. And all I did was listen to all the tapes that Brian didn't want to listen to, hundreds and hundreds. And I would have access to A&M studios, and I could go in there with bands. Like I brought Joey Vera in there to record his solo stuff. He ended up A&M passed, but he released it on his own. I brought Down by Law in there. A&M passed, they released their recordings. They had the rights to the recordings. So that was really fun. And after I was doing that for about a year, Brian came up with this idea. He's like, we don't really have a metal alternative department at A&M. Would you be interested if I set up a meeting with the marketing department and doing that? And I was like, sure. Because he had Damn the Machine, which was Chris Poland's band, and Paw and Monster Magnet and Therapy and all these bands at A&M kind of like, what are we going to do with these bands? Yeah. We don't know what to do. So they got me and they made me that guy. And that's how I ended up moving away from A&R into marketing.
Wow.
And they gave me this director of alternative marketing title. And that's when my life really got interesting, because my first thing they had me do was go on the road with Damn the Machine. Right. It was really cool because Chris Poland, even though he got kicked out of Megadeth because, they had a drug problem going on, him and Mustaine, and they wanted to split them up, he still had this reputation where everyone knew that Peace Sells, who's buying, those first Killing, whatever the first record, those two Megadeth records were like, people love those records. Yeah. So I got to go on the road with Chris Poland. Every night people would come after him with their Megadeth records looking for a signature. But it was a really fun band to be on the road with. And then I went on the road with Paw, Monster Magnet. Then other bands that weren't even heavy, they started sending me out with more mainstream bands. I had to cover Bryan Adams shows, Sting shows, Soundgarden, Sheryl Crow, Patty Griffin, Amy Grant, you name it. It was like I was all over the place. And I did that for like 6-7 years. I was like just running around like a maniac, and that was... it was funny though. I got to tell you, man, the whole time I was at A&M, I never felt like I fit in. Really? I always felt like an oddball working there. It was like really hard for me because I had that independent record mindset, but I had a nice expense account which I used a lot. Like I remember one time Dishwalla, the band Dishwalla, they had a big hit in America. They had a gold record. I took them out to dinner after show one night, and I was talking to some guy from a retail chain outside. I said, you guys go in the restaurant, I'll catch up with you. And I get in there and there's a bunch of bottles of wine on the table. It was an Italian restaurant. I didn't think nothing of it. So we ordered dinner, we ate and everything. And the waitress handed me the bill and I looked and it was $1,400. I'm like, fuck, what the fuck is this? And the wine were like $150 bottles of wine. So I had to call my boss the next day, Richie Gallen. I'm like, Richie, I had a $1,400 bill last night. I had to give like a $300 tip because I couldn't be an asshole and not give a tip. He's like, don't worry about it. It happens to all of us. It was like no big deal. And I realized, so this is how, the whole major label thing works. The recoupment. Don't worry, Dishwalla's paying for that, not you. And I'm like, so, there were a lot of things about major labels that were like really shady, dude. It was shady. And then I get to hear all the stories about what went on in the old days at A&M. Forget it, man. The payo, the hookers, the whole 9 yards, man. It's all true. It's all true. It all happened.
Fuck, man. So when you leave A&M then, we must be in the new millennium at this point.
It was close. It was close, and I was ready to leave. And because I had a band I was managing already, and I was working for A&M, nothing came of them. 2 of the members ended up on majors, but nothing came of it. They were called 3.5 Girls, and I decided I wanted to be a manager. So I then spent the next 15 years. No, not 15. 15 years I spent managing, and I started my own label, Red Car Records, which was a total bad timing. We spent all this money and lost all this money, and I just couldn't. Nobody bought records anymore by that time. That was like 2005, 6, 7,
sure.
8.
Yeah. So what made you want to get into management then? Why? What was the light bulb moment?
I decided that I wanted to be on the side of the bands and not on the side of the label. Like I never let any bands I work with do publishing deals, and I was on their side. I decided fuck the labels, And, I knew I had connections at labels, but I never got anyone signed to a major because it was too late. By 2000, nobody was getting signed anymore to major labels.
Sure.
And then Napster and everything went, crashed like hell. That's why I'm impressed with labels like Metal Blade and Roadrunner, that they managed to last through all that. I don't know how they did what they did. And some other independents have lasted too, but none of the majors did. They all went down the toilet.
So you've been managing for 15 years then. So you were managing for 15 years. So when did you stop that? Like 2015?
2015, yeah. When the Love Me Nots broke up, that was the end of the road for me. I was like, I'm going to take a break. And then it was a few years after that. That was more like 2016. I think they broke up, because it was only a couple of years after that I started thinking about the podcast, and I was like, I can talk, I'm like you, man. We can just talk. We've already been talking for an hour and 20 minutes.
Before we get to the podcast then, so what were the highlights of the management career then? Because this is something which I think it takes a particular mindset and a particular amount of patience, because while you're always on the band side from a label perspective up to this point, now you get to see them in a different light, right?
Yeah, well, all of the bands, well, not all of them, but several of the bands I worked with got good deals at independent labels. Mm-hmm. The big highlight, I'd have to say, a couple of the big highlights, the Charms, they got signed to Wicked Cool, which turned out to be a really shitty deal. But the good thing about it is they got to do a national tour with the New York Dolls. Oh, and they toured with Ian Hunter and the Zombies, and they toured with Cheap Trick. So that was great. When you have a band on the road with bands like that, and, they were like a $500 a night band, which means, my 10% of that was only $50, but every night, because you didn't make any money. I didn't make any money, man. I would have some months I'd make $4,000, and next month I'd make $400. It was like a licensing. And the other highlight was the Love Me Nots. We got a T-Mobile commercial. The Go-Go Girls I worked with for a little while, we got a deal with them. And a lot of the other bands, they put their own records out, and I helped them. I pretty much had to do everything. I was like the label and the manager.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And it's a lot of fun. I imagine it's a lot of work. I don't manage a label, nor do I manage a band, but I've got this fucking project, which is like, I imagine a lot of the lanes that I'm trying to travel down are very similar, because a lot of them are like licensing, managing resources and people, and trying to get the right output that captures the right fucking mood and all this stuff. It must be like 15 years is a long fucking haul for that.
Yeah, I don't mind admitting it, but, I put myself in an enormous financial hole and basically went broke because, I kept thinking next month is going to be better. Next month. No, one more month, another month. Yeah. It never got better. I mean, I had a few high points here and there, but I never had the money. The most successful managers have a lot of money, Yeah. If you don't have money, forget it. And I didn't have any money. So it ended up causing me never to get married, which is a good thing, actually, I think. No kids, because I married the music business.
Yeah.
And, I don't have regrets about this. I have no regrets about anything I did. From 84 to 2016, I was in it. I was in the game. Now, you know what? I feel like I'm in the game now, and I'm not really in it, but I feel like I'm in it,
Yeah. It's interesting. Not that you need anything from me, but it's in the 18 months that I've known you, you've never come across like as a damaged, as a broken, what's the damaged goods of the music industry? Because some people come out the other end just like, fucked.
I'm not bitter. Yeah, I was bitter. Like, I will admit to you, I was bitter when Poison sold 16 million records and I never got a nickel for it. That made me bitter. And I was bitter about a few other things, but I don't hold at anything. There's a couple people I don't like still in the business now, but I don't have to talk about that or them. Nope. They're not part of my life. So.
Yeah, man. So what is this the point where you got the break, you got your time off and then started the podcast?
Well, I started working. It's funny because I started making tacos for a living. I worked for Baby Loves Tacos. And the funny thing about it is they're a sponsor of my podcast now. That's how good of friends I am with the owner. But Zach and I was his first employee. And now he's got a very successful business, but I was the first guy. He hired me because he liked me and he knew that I was in the music business. It had nothing to do with my skills of culinary arts.
Yeah.
So I worked there, and he's the one that said, you should start a podcast. And I did in January 2019, put my first show out, and I've been at it ever since.
Crazy, man. Fuck, would you go back to doing any management or work for a label?
I have people all the time that ask me to manage them, but I just have not found the right opportunity yet.
And that means it must, a lot of it's gut feel, right? Most things are gut feel.
I gotta like the music. I tried working with some bands and I didn't like their music, and it's really difficult when you have to hide that, and just be like, it gives you a weird feeling, because I didn't like working with bands that I didn't like their music when I was at labels. Whenever I would get handed something I didn't like, it was hard for me. I have to feel passionate about it because I love music. It's my life, and if I'm not passionate about the artist or the record or whatever, I can't do it.
Yeah. It comes through as well. Like especially with, say, indie punk, rock, metal, I say this quite a lot, and I think this is what drove things like Metal Blade and Roadrunner. It's like inauthenticity is the fucking killer. The second you can, because we can smell from a mile away when someone's not putting everything into it.
And let me add this: at a label like Metal Blade, everyone loved all the bands. We loved our bands. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there.
Yep.
At A&M Records, no, there was a bunch of pretentious fucks working at that label. People that just wanted to be in the music business. They didn't take the road I took, man, to get there. They cut out of college radio and went right to A&M. And I'm like, you didn't pay your dues, man. You didn't have to work in an office with 8 people jammed in one room like I did when I was at Enigma, or like Holly and I did at Roadrunner or Giant. We didn't even have windows in my office at Giant. It was like they put up these plywood walls around us, and Homestead was behind the plywood, Homestead Records, So those guys at A&M was spoiled rotten. And they would talk behind half the bands, like this band sucks. Why are we working with them? They had negative things to say about just about everybody. There weren't very many bands there that would come along. Like, when we put Van Morrison out, of course, nobody would say nothing bad about Van the Man, But, some of the other bands, they didn't give a shit. They just did not care. There was not a lot of integrity at a major label,
That's the word. All right, man. I don't know what else to close out on, because the podcast is that's where we are at present day.
We're going to close out on me asking you a question about your documentary, and because I'm honored that I was asked to be in it. And what do you feel about how it's going for you right now? I'm turning into the host for a minute here. No, so cool. How do you think it's going? I mean, and what have you accomplished, and how do you feel about it?
Oh, dude. Okay. So this, as an exercise, this is going to be interesting, because I'm going to answer you now, and then when this thing comes out, we should reflect on what I say now.
Because can I ask you when you think it's going to come out?
Everyone asks that, and the answer is, I'm hoping within 18 months to 2 years, but it all depends. It depends on the financing, and it depends, because there's the advantage of my current job. My real job is I'm a project manager, so I can sort of at least give an arbitrary date and work backwards, right? So there's at the minute, there's 3 plans. There's the zero budget plan, there's the partial budget plan, and then there's the full budget plan. And depending on how much money this thing can raise and how close to which plan it is, depends on how it's going to come out. So it could be 5 years, 18 months, somewhere in between.
Okay. Do you feel like you have successful content right now?
I think yes. And I feel that way for the main reason is there's a knowledge gap. There's a massive knowledge gap. No one knows fucking anything about Roadrunner, right? There's Slipknot and Nickelback, and there's the period after, and people are very aware of the controversies around Roadrunner. There's certain disputes, contractual disputes with the bands. They know of this guy called Monty Connor, and that's kind of it. That's kind of it. Like, I remember I did the press release like last July, fucking hell, nearly a year ago. And now I'm not the smartest man in the world, but I don't read comments on any of the things that I do because I'm not a fucking idiot. But I've got a confidant who sort of like relays things back to me as it becomes important. And he said, one guy said, I'll watch it up until Monty Connor signs Nickelback. And I was like, all right, there's definitely an education required here because this is going to be watching the whole thing because Monty didn't sign Nickelback, you know? And so it's
right.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that it started out in the 90s as road racing. It's like, no, none of this stuff is true. So there's a lot of people that don't know anything about this label, which is great because that's exactly what the documentary aims to do. But there's also like this other thing, which I'm hoping you've clocked in on in our 18 months of knowing each other. But there's a relationship between the label and the artist, which is quite mystical. And I'm hoping to demystify this relationship. And I'm hoping to sort of like understand and help other people understand that while every great band has great music and there's a great thing in the art, there's also infrastructure that pushes it forward. And I meant what I said earlier when I said like there's probably like a 10, 20 bands which are going to be my favorite band in the whole world, which I'll never hear because it wasn't captured by that system. And I think it's the end of the story is effectively it's a kind of a pure heart story because no one sets out to fuck anyone over when it comes to music. I think everyone wants to propagate music and make more metal happen. That's the phrase I use quite often, especially in the case of say like a Roadrunner or a Metal Blade. And I think it's hopefully the end point will be really amplifying that message, right? And hopefully put it in a modern context where it's saying, we're facing a massive saturation of music, but with the right ingredients, we can maybe give metal a real seat at the table. And, hard rock and punk and all the other things, because there's an outlier genre, right? And we all enjoy our outlier genres. But in the current climate, there's just absolutely no fucking way it's going to penetrate into anything totally meaningful without some help. And what better way to understand how to do that as a culture than figure out how the best did it?
Let me ask you one other question. What is your goal as far as the length goes? And is it going to be more than one part?
At the minute, it's going to be 3 feature lengths.
3 feature lengths of how long about?
About 90 minutes each.
Wow. And they're going to be like DVD, or they're going to go straight to like
if no one
Netflix?
Funds this thing, right? If no one funds this thing, it's going to go on YouTube. And it's going to go on YouTube with the best quality I can possibly muster, which at the minute is like 4K.
Please don't be one of those directors that gets mad and throws it in the vault, and we have to wait 20 years like the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. We have to wait like all those years before. Don't do that, please. Release
I own everything, so there's no like third or fourth or fifth pie who's going to get embroiled in the legalese. I own the thing, so whatever happens, it will be finished. And and I've been at it for nearly 2 years now. So and if I was going to get bored, I'd be bored by now, and it's not boring yet, right?
Well, let me publicly, in front of the whole world that's listening right now, thank you for involving me in the project. It's just it was bewildering to me at first when I was being asked to talk about a label that I only worked for 8 months and I got fired from. But if you think about it, and I know you have, it was an eventful 8 months for that label. So, I mean, I'm glad I was there, and I'm glad I experienced the grief and the grief. I'm glad I experienced the grief of Roadrunner Records.
It's so crazy, man. Because like when we started this, I say we because you were like episode 5. The whole thing was meant to be like, it's just going to be some fucking Zoom calls and a fucking PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to put it on YouTube, and that's kind of it. But now it's got picked up legs, and we had no right to bump into each other in Brooklyn the way that we did, which was really cool because obviously I had you down for the interview. But when I was just walking down the street and I heard someone shout my name, I was like, I never thought I'd meet Steve Riccardo outside of a Mexican fucking burrito shop.
Of course, I was at a Mexican place eating tacos. What do you expect, man?
No, it was cool though. I mean, how did you feel meeting all those guys again? For context, we all went out for dinner at
it was really
Manhattan.
Interesting. It was interesting because being in the same room with some of those guys, I only knew like 3 of them, I think. And I'm going to go back to Nickelback for a second, because I know what it's like to sign a band and all of a sudden everyone thinks you're like an idiot for signing them, because I went through that with Poison. I mean, people didn't really, not everyone likes Poison, and maybe they dislike Nickelback more. So that guy seemed like a really interesting guy, and they all did. I mean, I enjoyed it, and I just felt like it was weird. I had a weird feeling like, wow, I'm really an outcast with this crew. But then again, you know what? I've always felt that way being in the music business. I've always felt like an outcast. I always feel like I never really fit in anywhere, you know? So it wasn't that bad at all.
Hey, man.
And I don't drink anymore, so I couldn't pound down all the alcohol like you guys were. But,
you know what's kind of sad about it? Because like, it was kind of like a watershed moment, because again, like, this wasn't meant to happen. I'm fucking nobody. Yeah, we were at the table with all those dudes, and I was so tired, as you found out the next morning. I was so tired, so jet lagged, and I was so busy and so stressed and all these things. There's a lot of that meal I can't remember, and it comes back as like an acid flashback. But my position on that whole thing was like, I was very much a fly on the wall watching all these A&R guys like talk shop, and it was really fascinating. The shit.
Yeah, I did enjoy it. It was good seeing Doug Keogh, especially because I hadn't seen him in so long. And Monty is an interesting guy. No matter what anyone says about him, he's been there as long as I have. I think he started maybe 1 or 2 years after I did in the business. So he's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
So I respect people that have been able to last that long. Like, I don't know how those guys are still working for labels. I give them credit. Him and Gitter, I'm like, I say the same thing to Gitter. I'm like, how the hell can you still be doing this? He just loves music, man. He can't stop doing it.
Yeah.
Can't stop doing it.
It's crazy. And it's important for me to get the knowledge from these guys as to how they did it, and yourself, obviously, before, like, as this next generation ushers in and tries to make the next big outcast band something big, it's important to get that information. But yeah, hopefully it doesn't all get taken away from me, and hopefully I don't get sued into oblivion, and I'm still doing it in a few years, and hopefully I'm still as enthusiastic about it. But
please don't get sued.
I don't plan on getting sued. I do not plan on getting sued. You never know. Tomorrow could be the day.
Well, I'm with you, man, right till the bitter end.
Thanks, man.
For the happy end. I want to be, you know what call I want to get? The call like, are you coming down to New York for the premiere? And that's the day I'm going to be like, run into New York.
Dude, I honestly, it was so good. I'm glad we got to do this, because it was important that I tried to at least highlight the rest of your career. But I really wanted it to be like the morning after, with the dictaphone just on a coffee table, so we'd have like all like the Brooklyn background noise. But
it was because of you, man. That it wasn't because you weren't in good shape that day.
It wasn't that. It's because I had a camera die on me the day before, as you know, because you got the 6K treatment. So I had to like navigate the Manhattan subway system to get this part, and luckily I did. Luckily I managed to get it, and the rest of the interviews were like the 2 camera jobbies. Did I send you some footage, by the way? I think I sent you something, didn't I?
Yeah, you sent me a really short thing, but you don't have to send me a lot. I can be surprised when it comes out. Or you can send me more and get my opinion. I don't care. Whatever you want to do, man. I'm with you. I'm 100%. I'm 100% behind this project, man. I really am. I can't wait to get to see it released.
I can't wait to just see it fucking finished in a good way. I like it. It's the thing that like the frustration is just trying to make sure I can commit the time and make sure that that the plan I've got is like a stable plan. But yeah, I think the track is interesting. The politics of it are interesting. That's the stage I'm at now, right? It's like, and that's like I was saying earlier, people think I'm working with Roadrunner. I'm like, I'm not fucking working with Roadrunner. There's a lot of ex-Roadrunner people that like me, but I'm not working with Warner in any capacity. But yeah, I'm more on that off the record because it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you, man, for having me.
Dude, thanks for joining me. Let's close it out there, but I did want to tell you something. Oh, that's more for